we have an obligation under our law to keep personal information secure, and the sort of standard is reasonable steps, and that can be interpreted in different ways. Certain information is subject to additional constraints. So if you're operating in the health sector, for example, then there are certain higher standards that have to apply. I think what's relevant from a cloud context, because many of these privacy issues apply to all sorts of iTech. So about getting consent before you collect this data, what you do with the data when you collect it. So all of those type of issues apply across the board. But what I think is unique or specific for cloud computing is the transporter data flow provisions. Because again, if you're taking that data and sending it off into the cloud offshore, what does that mean? Well, you've got to require your provider to meet the Australian standard. So that's what the law says at present, that you have to have some sort of contractual regime which imposes on the provider an obligation to meet that standard, and then you get a free pass, I guess, basically. I'm simplifying it a bit, but I think what's important to note is that there are anticipated changes coming through the Parliament one of these days, which will lead to an increase in the standards. And what it will mean is that you have to have those measures in place with the counterparty, but simply complying with those measures does not absolve you of responsibility. And I think that's the big change. So you still need to make sure that the person to whom you're sending that data has in place those measures. But if they do something wrong, you're still liable. And that's an important shift, because before you weren't. Some issues are more difficult to overcome. What happens if the cloud provider goes insolvent? And we have had one client of ours who's had a situation where a provider to their cloud provider went insolvent, and this was offshore in another country. That becomes very difficult to manage. Obviously, you've got receivers stepping in, you've got administrators, they're locking everything up. You're saying, but I've got my data on that server, they're carting it off. It just becomes practically very difficult, very cumbersome. Obviously, the problems are magnified even more where it's an offshore provider, or there could be multiple providers in multiple jurisdictions, and you're dealing with regulatory regimes in different countries. So that is a big issue. Stepping in also becomes a problematic issue. So I'm not sure if people here are familiar with step in, but that's more of a concept that's applicable in an outsourcing. So where the customer says to a large outsourcing provider, well, if you do things really badly, we want the right to be able to step in to the facility and take control. So that's a concept we often see in larger outsourcings. That becomes a lot more problematic for obvious reasons in a shared environment, in a cloud computing context, and where are you stepping into anyway? So that's a challenge.